Hi, Kevin. Kevin Doyle from is the artistic director of Sponsored for Nobody. It's a company, an arts company, works across disciplines, based in New York and Brussels, in Brooklyn and Brussels. Thanks for talking to me all the way from Dhaka in Bangladesh, by the way.
Yes, thank you, David. I'm in Dhaka working right now. How are you?
I'm pretty good. I wanted to talk a little bit about the kind of the cultural policy implications for America, and obviously they have implications more broadly around the globe on Donald Trump's presidency that it will begin in January, and what your thoughts are in relationship to the dynamics of his own politics and how that will be brought to bear on American culture and more broadly global culture.
Well, I think I should say from the beginning that I don't think Donald Trump or his advisors have any cultural policy whatsoever. So if that's the harbinger of what's to come, it's a pretty bleak one. American cultural policy, I think, is very weak to begin with, because we have seen over the last 30 years or so an erosion of the original intentions of the cultural policy that was formed in the 1960s, which was itself, nothing compared to what Canada might have or Australia might have to begin with. So what's already weak or barely existing, I think, is going to be even lessened and weakened even more, just by a total lack of focus or concentration by him or his advisors. The Republican right has had it in their crosshairs since the age of Reagan that they want to eliminate all public funding for the arts and public discourse, whether that's public television, public radio, publicly funded dance companies or theater companies, or even museums. They've had it in their crosshairs for a long time. And even though I think Trump is not really interested in the arts or cultural policy, I think the people around him, and especially the people in Congress, are going to use the opportunity to pretty much wipe out whatever is left very quickly, I think. Because he has control, the Republicans have control of both the Senate and the House at this point. And if you
have a triple threat.
Yes, and if you follow a pattern of what far right Republicans have done on the state level, where they have total control of, say, a governorship, a state House, and a state Senate, what they've done in say the state of Kansas, for example, is they pretty much have wiped out everything very quickly and swiftly and almost overnight. And I would expect the same thing to happen with what is left of American arts and cultural policy. I think the people who wrote the original legislation and the people who have fought for it before in the 1980s or the 1990s are long dead and gone. And one of the things I've found in my research across a lot of countries over the last couple of years is that when the original architects of this legislation or policy retire or have died or passed away, that we seem to have lost some of the vocabulary that led to those successful arguments in the first place. We've lost some type of knowledge base or vocabulary because people in the present don't know the actual history. And in the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan tried to wipe out American cultural policy, the leaders who wrote the legislation, both Republican and Democrat at the time, a different style of Republican, obviously, they were able to contact all of their voters in their districts and rise up and stop the bill from passing and retain what we had. I think that ability and capacity is long gone, and we're all just signing petitions on Facebook instead, and that doesn't really cut it.
And do you think that I mean, one of the interesting things about Australia in the last Australian art scene in the last sort of year or so is as a result of the sort of the incursions on the National Arts Agency by the Conservative government that was recently re-elected on a fairly reduced majority, but still re-elected. It sort of exposed, if you like, or it exposed existing fractures within the Australian art scene, and one of the elements that was sort of become most prominent was those kind of grassroots movement, which is what the conference at Arts Front is really talking to. And there is a sense that artists in particular want to rise up and take some ownership and responsibility for the advocacy to ensure that not only does that not happen again, but actually that there is a much greater presence of the arts in the national conversation. And I'm quite mindful in that space that Australia is not America, and that there's been a sort of separate sort of trajectory going on, or different trajectory going on, as you might expect, and perhaps we're a bit closer to Canada in that respect. I know you have a lot of experience, and what's interesting about your work is it's a kind of comparative in some ways between America and Europe. How do you read the kind of what's going on in Europe in terms of through the prism of what may come for America?
Well, can you say that again? In terms of what's
well, how do you see what's happening in Europe at the moment in terms of the space, the cultural policy space, and the cultural politics through the prism of what might be coming for America, which is obviously going through this, as you say, a sort of almost reducing to zero?
Yeah, I think actually the comparison is flipped. Actually, I think what happened to the United States in the 1990s, where the NEA budget was cut in half, and the bold reaching narrative that the arts had a very clear role to play in a modern democracy, that happened to us first, and I think that has filtered through different countries in Europe at different rates. I think it's happened at a faster rate in the UK or in the Netherlands, but I think that it's also happened in Finland. I think it's also happened in Sweden. It's also happened in Belgium. It's just happening at slower rates. So for me, the equation is actually that what's happened to the United States in the 90s, when the hammer was brought down, has been filtering through into Europe now, finally, and yeah, I think that's my impression of it. And I just wanted to go back though to something that you said about the grassroots level of the Australian art scene. One very sad conclusion that I've come to, I'm not proud of having to come to this conclusion, is that it's very difficult to say, but I'm going to get in trouble. But one of the things that was successful about the counterattack in the 1980s that congressional leaders led to beat Reagan in the United States was that it was not just artists who were fighting back. It was regular people. Regular people were part of writing their congressmen, writing their senators, saying, "I don't want you to cut this funding because this is happening in my community. This is something that is value for me in urban Detroit or suburban Oregon or whatever." And it was a broad-based coalition of people writing in with senators, with artists. And I think we make a very major mistake, both in Belgium or whether it's the United States or elsewhere, if it's only the artists who are talking to the congressional or the government leaders. I think we make a very serious mistake that to only go there on our own in a way. So I admire artists who want to be involved in the process. But unless we also bring bring our neighbors with us, or bring people with us, or involve them also, it's just going to be another clusterfuck. Pardon my French. Does that make sense?
I think one of the things that we find is that if you can see it with other sort of successful, grassroots movements, if you remain within your sector, then you end up struggling to talk to anybody other than yourself. And while it can give you good practice, while you can practice what you want to say and how you want to articulate it, unless you develop cross-sectoral or intersectoral relationships and have used the language of other sectors, then you end up ghettoizing your own identity and your own language. And,
yes.
One of the discussions we've really had a lot in this space is, how do we actually take it out of the arts and make it a problem for society?
Yes.
And that we try and solve that together, because working in isolation, the likelihood of failure is greatest.
Yes, and I totally agree, and I've written about that too. That our efforts have to be coordinated in America with organized labor, with civil rights issues. It's having a healthy funded public broadcasting, healthy funded public arts cultural sector is part of having a modern democracy. It's not just about voting rights. It's not just about equal rights. It's about our rights have been established in the cultural sector as well, and we forget that in a way. We forget that they're actually rights. It's in the UN Charter, for example, in the Human Rights Charter, and what was I going to say about that? Oh, I just forgot. Sorry. The best example that I would urge people to look at that I've seen in my travels over the last 2 or 3 years in my work is what happened in Finland at the Baltic Circle Festival in November of 2014, where they had this day-long event in City Hall of Helsinki. It's called the Make Arts Policy event, and the whole thing is live streamed and on Vimeo at the Baltic Circle Vimeo page, I think, and where they had all the politicians from all the 8 or 12 major parties in Finland present their cultural policy to a mass assembly of people, both artists and the general citizens. And it was a performance piece that was lasting 4 hours or so. The audience had the ability to raise certain colored cards where they could stop the politicians from talking and ask them to be more specific, or ask them to explain how that would work and other stuff like that. And it was a beautiful, long, almost multi-hour performance that had regular citizens there. It had artists there. It had politicians there. It had everybody there. It was genius, and there's no reason why that model can't be replicated in other places. It's pretty cool. May I
ask the question, did it actually affect positive change in that space?
I think it did. Was that a dog? Sorry.
That's my dog. Somebody's at the door.
Okay. It did. Yeah. Do you want to stop?
Yeah, much. Wait 1 sec.
Yes.
There you go.
My understanding in Finland is that it did initially. They saw a spike in this conversation on a national level. I don't know actually what's happened of late in Finland, but I witnessed the entire event in person. I was there on a fellowship, and I thought it was very successful. But I think the Finns are kind of a little bit better at it than everybody else is, because maybe they're more separate from the rest of Europe by language and by distance. So I think there is still robust cultural policy there, but I could be mistaken. But my understanding is that it was successful, at least pushing the needle a little bit and maintaining what they had. If not, it didn't. I don't think it. Yeah.
I think those deliberative democracy models have, more effect than just on the issue that they're dealing with. They actually amplify the experience of civil society and allow the citizens to take ownership of decisions, and that, in as much as what affects directly on the policy or the issues that they're talking about, is something to be understood and processed as being a very good and productive thing. And as you know, I mean, in America, 55% vote. So there's barely a majority ownership of democracy in America.
Oh yeah, yeah, and I've been saying it for years. Bernie Sanders has said it all year. Bernie Sanders said it for a year and a half, that unless we have bigger turnout in the election, we're going to lose, and lose badly. And he was laughed at the Democratic National Committee by all the party elites back in August of 2015. Him and the other candidate at the time, Martin O'Malley, the former governor of Maryland, they both said this very clearly. And it's the number one problem of American democracy, is that nobody participates.
I'd like to sort of finish our discussion with just one question. I read your interpretation of a speech that Trump gave in August was it Jacksonville?
It was Jacksonville, Florida. It was in early August of this year at Jacksonville, Florida. Yeah. Yeah,
and you talked about how you felt like then that Trump was going to win, and the reason was because he was talking in a certain way and to certain demographics that simply hadn't registered elsewhere, but had been kind of growing in force over the last generation. Could you just talk a bit about that?
Well, I think what was shocking about watching the video, the entire rally campaign speech, there were introductory speakers and both Trump himself. It lasted for about, like 3 hours. What was shocking was that this way of talking that I get at in the essay, this compressive way of talking and this compressive way of conflating facts and reality and this more terse way of talking, which is, I think, derived from 25 plus years of watching Law and Order episodes, and a lot of other things. What was shocking was that this way of talking cut across all demographics. It created a new demographic that is what at this Jacksonville rally you saw. He was introduced by an African-American woman. An African-American woman who was a former elected official in Florida who grew up in New York City. It's astonishing. And he was introduced by another woman later on in the rally. And there were African-Americans in the audience. There were women in the audience, white, Hispanic, and this compressive logic, this compressive way of talking, cut across all boundaries. That was the most shocking thing at the rally, and that it was not this monolithic white racist audience that the media would want you to believe, even though that element may be very present. It was something else going on, and it's this way of talking that I heard my own family, my mother talks this way, my relatives talk this way. It's this compressive, terse way of talking that he was using this language. He was employing this language, and yeah, people thought that he was an idiot, but in actuality, I thought he was a genius at employing this way of speaking to the masses and to anybody who was listening. And I mean, if you in the essay that I talk about, I mean, if you go to a rest stop in Ohio on the Ohio freeway and you sit down and have a burger and you listen to everybody around you in their orange yellow tables made out of plastic talking, everybody talks this way. It's like almost like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And it cuts across, at least what I've seen, across race and gender.
Right. Kevin, thank you so much. That's great food for thought, and we'll make sure that people are referred to that essay in particular. Language is the key, and
yes.
And finding new ways of listening, I think, for a world in which there's a lot of presumption and assumption out there, that if we take, I feel like sometimes that we need to take more than the usual beat into when somebody talks, that we need to try and take another beat and another beat and another beat, and then something else will come out, and that's actually where the gold is. It's not in what's said first up. So
exactly.
that of course is not the case with you in this interview.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, Ken. Thanks very much for talking, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
All right, I appreciate it. Thank you.